She was once the wife of one of the most powerful men in the city, until he threw her out into the rain like a broken object, wiping out every account, every relationship, every escape. But that night, an armored SUV pulled up on the side of the road, and the man inside was the ghost the whole city feared. 3 years later, she returned, not to beg, but to burn it all down. If you want to know how she did it, follow the story to the end, hit like, and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has come. The rain didn't fall that night. It attacked. It came sideways off the harbor, driven by wind that screamed between the glass towers of Blackthorn City like something wounded. The kind of rain that found its way through collars, through seams, through any crack a person was foolish enough to leave open. And Seraphina Vale had nothing but cracks. She stood barefoot on $40 million worth of Italian marble, and she could feel the cold of it climbing through her soles into her shin bones. The penthouse was climate-controlled to a precise 68 degrees, but her feet were freezing. Her hands, too. The divorce papers shook between her fingers, not because of the temperature, but because something deep in her chest had started to come apart. Something structural, like a load-bearing wall giving way inside a building that looked fine from the outside. Across the living room, Nolan Pierce was adjusting his cufflinks. That was what killed her. Not the papers, not the words he'd said 20 minutes ago in front of 14 of the city's most powerful investors, each one holding a champagne flute and pretending not to watch her world collapse. Not even the woman standing beside him, Celeste Arden, 26 years old, trust fund jaw, pregnancy barely showing beneath a dress that cost more than most people's cars. None of that delivered the final blow. It was the cufflinks. He was standing there, tugging at the gold links on his left wrist, with the focused attention of a man running late for a reservation, as though the last 9 years of their marriage had been a minor scheduling conflict, as though she were an invoice he'd finally gotten around to disputing. "You were never good enough for this world," he said without looking up. Seraphina's mouth opened. Nothing came out. She had rehearsed 1,000 responses to 1,000 cruelties over 9 years. Quiet ones, clever ones, ones that would land perfectly in the shower 3 hours after the conversation ended. But standing there, barefoot, with mascara tracking down her cheeks, and the faint laughter of departing guests still echoing from the foyer, she had nothing. Celeste shifted her weight and placed one manicured hand on Nolan's arm. The gesture was small, almost tender, and it was designed to be witnessed. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was the statement, young, fertile, connected to old money that made Nolan's fortune look like pocket change. She was the upgrade. Seraphina was the trade-in. "The car will take you to whatever hotel you choose tonight," Nolan said, finally glancing at her. His eyes were the color of lake ice, and they carried exactly as much warmth. "After that, you're on your own. My attorneys will handle the rest." "The accounts," Seraphina managed. Her voice sounded foreign to her, thin, cracked at the edges. "My accounts, the joint savings, There are no joint accounts anymore." The sentence landed like a door slamming in a quiet house. She stared at him. "That's not... You can't just..." "It's done, Seraphina." He said her name the way people said the name of a street they used to live on. Mild recognition, nothing more. "My legal team restructured everything this morning. The signatures you provided last quarter gave us the authorization we needed. You should have read what you signed." She felt her knees soften. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in movies. Just a subtle loosening of the joints, a suggestion from her body that standing upright was becoming optional. She locked them. She would not give him the image of her on the floor. Not in front of Celeste. Not in front of the caterers still packing Crystal in the next room. "I gave you everything," she whispered. Nolan pulled his jacket from the back of a chair and shrugged it on. "You gave me what you had. It wasn't enough." He walked past her toward the private elevator, Celeste's heels clicking beside him like a metronome counting down the final seconds of Seraphina's old life. At the elevator doors, he paused. "Don't contact me again. Don't contact my family. Don't contact the firm." He pressed the button. The doors opened with a soft chime. "If you try to go public with anything, my attorneys will bury you so deep you'll need a map to find daylight." The doors closed. The penthouse went silent except for the rain hammering against glass and the distant hum of a city that didn't know her name and never would. Seraphina stood there for 11 minutes. She counted. Not intentionally. Her brain simply started marking time the way a machine continues to operate after the operator has walked away. 11 minutes of standing on cold marble, holding papers that formalized the end of everything she'd built her identity around, listening to the rain try to break through the windows. Then she moved. She found a suitcase in the guest bedroom closet. She packed without thinking. Clothes grabbed by the handful, shoes mismatched, a toothbrush, a phone charger. She didn't take jewelry. She didn't take the fur coat or the designer bags arranged like museum pieces in her walk-in closet. She took a photograph from the nightstand. Herself at 23, standing on a dock somewhere in Maine, laughing at something she couldn't remember. Before Nolan, before the money. Before she forgot what her own face looked like when it wasn't performing. The doorman in the lobby didn't look at her. He'd been instructed not to. She could tell by the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his eyes fixed on a point 6 inches above her head as she walked past dragging a suitcase with a broken wheel. The car Nolan promised wasn't there. Of course it wasn't. She stepped outside and the rain hit her like a physical assault. Within seconds, her silk blouse was plastered to her skin, her hair was streaming, and the suitcase handle was slippery in her grip. She started walking without a destination. There was nowhere to go. The friends she'd had, Nolan's friends, she understood now, would already have received whatever story he'd crafted. The sympathetic shake of the head, the whispered, "We had no idea she was so unstable." The quiet removal of her number from their phones. She walked for 40 minutes through streets that blurred behind sheets of water. Downtown gave way to the harbor district, where the buildings were older and meaner and the streetlights buzzed with dying bulbs. Her feet were bleeding. She'd stepped on something, glass maybe, or a piece of metal grating, and hadn't felt it until she noticed the pink trail she was leaving on the wet concrete. The SUV appeared out of the rain like something that had been waiting there all along. It was black, heavy, armored in a way that civilian vehicles weren't supposed to be. It rolled alongside her at walking speed, tires hissing through the standing water. Seraphina's first instinct was fear, a bright animal flash of it that tightened her throat and made her fist clench around the suitcase handle. But fear requires energy, and she had burned through her last reserve somewhere around block 15. The rear window descended 2 inches, just enough to let a voice through. "You're bleeding." She didn't stop walking. "I'm aware." "You're also heading toward the Port District. At this hour, that's a decision with consequences." She stopped then, turned toward the window. Rain streamed down her face, and she didn't bother to wipe it. Through the gap in the glass, she could see the interior. Dark leather, the amber glow of a single reading lamp, and a man sitting with the stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago that movement was a form of vulnerability. "Who are you?" she asked. The window lowered another inch. She could see his face now, sharp features carved from something harder than bone. Dark hair pushed back from a broad forehead. Eyes that were nearly black, with a quality to them she couldn't immediately name. Not cruelty exactly, but an absence of the polite fictions that most people wore like clothing. This was a face that had stopped pretending. "Someone who knows what Nolan Pierce just did to you," he said, "and someone who knows exactly what it cost him to do it." "That doesn't answer my question." A pause. The faintest suggestion of amusement at the corner of his mouth, gone before it fully formed. Damien Volkov. The name landed in her chest like a stone dropped into deep water. She'd heard it before. Everyone in Blackthorn had. Not spoken aloud, usually. More like a pressure change in a room, a conversation that stopped mid-sentence when certain people walked in. Nolan had mentioned him once, years ago, after too much scotch at a fundraiser. "The kind of man who makes problems disappear," he'd said, and the way his voice had thinned on the word disappear told her everything about the kind of disappearance he meant. "Get in," Volkov said. "I don't get into cars with strangers." "You're standing barefoot in a rainstorm in a neighborhood where 3 people were killed last month. You have no money, no phone service. Yes, he already canceled it, and nowhere to sleep tonight. You're not in a position to be selective about strangers." She hated that he was right. She hated more that he'd said it without a trace of pity. Pity she could have resisted. The plain truth was harder to walk away from. "What do you want?" she asked. Volkov considered the question the way a chess player considers a board. Not the immediate move, but the 6 moves that would follow it. "Right now," he said, "I want you out of the rain." She stood there for what felt like a long time but was probably 7 seconds. The rain drove harder. Her feet throbbed. Somewhere behind her, a bottle broke against concrete, and a voice shouted something she couldn't make out. She opened the door and got in. The interior of the SUV smelled like leather and something faintly metallic. Gun oil, she would later learn. The seats were warm. A man in the front passenger seat turned his head slightly at her entrance, then turned back. Driver, security detail. She clocked both without fully understanding why she was cataloging them. The door closed and the city noise dropped to a murmur. Volkov didn't look at her immediately. He finished a message on a phone that didn't look like any phone she'd ever seen. Thicker, heavier, the screen emitting a cold blue light, then placed it face down on the seat beside him. "There's a towel in the compartment to your left," he said. She found it. Dried her face, her arms. The towel came away streaked with mascara and diluted blood. She stared at the stains and felt something shift inside her. Not grief anymore, but something older and more dangerous. A door closing that she hadn't known was still open. "Why were you on that street?" she asked. "I wasn't. I was on my way from a meeting at the harbor. My driver saw you walking and I recognized you." "Recognized me how?" Nolan Pierce's wife isn't difficult to identify, even soaking wet and bleeding. Your picture's been in enough society pages. "Ex-wife," she said. The word tasted metallic. "As of 2 hours ago." Volkov studied her with an expression she couldn't decode. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't calculation. It was something in between, an assessment that included both. "Where would you like to go?" he asked. She almost laughed. The question was absurd. Where would she like to go? To a time machine, to a version of her life where she hadn't walked into a cocktail party at 24 and been dazzled by a man with a Roman nose and a way of listening that made you feel like the only person alive. To a universe where she'd kept her own bank account, her own apartment, her own name in a lease somewhere. "I don't know," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd spoken in 9 years. Volkov was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned forward slightly and spoke to the driver in a language she didn't recognize. The SUV changed direction smoothly, turning north. "I have a property on the north end of the city," he said. "Guest quarters, private security. No one will know you're there unless you want them to." "And what do you get out of it?" "Tonight? Nothing." He settled back into his seat. "I'm not in the habit of making offers that require immediate repayment. That's for men like your ex-husband." The SUV moved through the rain-smeared streets of Blackthorn, and Seraphina watched the city slide past through tinted glass. Everything looked different from the inside of an armored vehicle. Smaller, more manageable. As though the world outside was a problem that could be contained behind a layer of bulletproof glass. They drove in silence for 20 minutes. She didn't feel the need to fill it, and neither did he. It was a strange comfort, the absence of performance, of the constant social calibration she'd spent 9 years perfecting. Volkov wasn't trying to make her comfortable or uncomfortable. He was simply present, in the manner of someone who had long ago decided that other people's emotional states were their own responsibility. The property was not what she expected. She'd imagined something garish, a crime lord's mansion dripping with gold fixtures and marble statues. Instead, the SUV pulled through a gate in a high stone wall and stopped before a converted industrial building, 3 stories of weathered brick and steel-framed windows that glowed with warm light. The grounds were minimal. Clean gravel, a few old trees, floodlights positioned with the precision of someone who understood that security and aesthetics could coexist. A woman met them at the door, mid-40s, short dark hair, a face built for competence rather than charm. Volkov introduced her as Marin. "She'll show you the guest suite. There's food if you're hungry. Clothes will be brought in the morning." Seraphina hesitated at the threshold. The rain hammered the gravel behind her, and the warmth from inside the building reached her like a hand extended. "I need to understand something," she said, turning back to face him. "You said you know what Nolan did, and what it cost him. What did you mean?" Volkov stood with his hands in his pockets, rain misting around him in the floodlights. He looked like a man who had been carved out of the weather itself. "Your husband, ex-husband, has been laundering money through his development firm for the better part of 6 years. Shell companies in 3 jurisdictions. He used your name on several of them without your knowledge. The divorce isn't just personal, it's strategic. He's distancing himself from the paper trail before the walls close in. The ground tilted beneath her feet. What? The documents you signed last quarter, the ones he mentioned tonight, they weren't financial restructuring. They were liability transfers. He moved the exposure onto you. If anyone comes looking for the fraud, the signatures lead to your name. Seraphina's hand found the doorframe. She gripped it until her knuckles whitened. He set me up. Elegantly, Volkov said, without a trace of admiration. The divorce makes you the scapegoat. The public humiliation ensures no one will believe your side, and the financial blackout guarantees you can't afford legal counsel to fight it. She felt the anger then, not the hot, performative kind she'd seen in movies, not thrown plates and screamed obscenities. This was something colder, quieter, a pilot light igniting in a dark furnace, invisible but producing heat that could, given fuel and time, melt steel. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know. He paused. And because Nolan Pierce has been a problem in my city for longer than he's been a problem in your marriage. She searched his face for the lie, the angle, the hidden transaction. It was there. She wasn't naive enough to believe it wasn't. Damian Volkov didn't pull drowning women from the street out of charity. There was a game here, and she was being positioned on a board she couldn't yet see. But for the first time in 9 years, someone had told her the truth without packaging it in a way that served themselves first, or at least without pretending that it didn't serve them at all. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow, you'll have decisions to make. He turned and walked back to the SUV, his silhouette swallowed by rain and darkness. Marin led her upstairs to a clean, spare room with a bed made in military corners and a window overlooking the walled courtyard. There were towels folded on the bathroom counter, a first aid kit for her feet, a glass of water on the nightstand. Seraphina sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. She thought about calling someone, but her phone was dead. Nolan had killed the service, just as Volkov said. She thought about crying, but the tears had dried up somewhere between the penthouse and the harbor district, replaced by something denser and more durable. She thought about the documents she'd signed in Nolan's office 3 months ago, his hand on her shoulder, his voice warm and reassuring. Just standard updates, sweetheart. Tax stuff. Nothing you need to worry about. The pen had been heavy. She remembered that. A Mont Blanc with gold trim. She'd signed 11 pages without reading a single one because she'd trusted him the way you trust gravity. Completely, unconsciously, and with no plan for what happens when it suddenly reverses. She unwrapped the bandages from the first aid kit and cleaned the cuts on her feet. The antiseptic burned, and she let it. The pain was specific, located, manageable, unlike everything else. At some point, she lay down. Sleep came not as a comfort, but as a system shutdown, her body simply refusing to process any more input. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was the photograph she'd taken from the penthouse. Herself at 23, standing on that dock, laughing. She didn't recognize the woman in it. She woke at 4 a.m. to the sound of boots on gravel below her window. Security rotation. She lay in the dark and listened to the disciplined footsteps pass beneath her, and for reasons she couldn't articulate, she felt safer than she had in years. By morning, the rain had stopped, and Blackthorn City lay beneath a gray, exhausted sky. Marin brought coffee and clothes. Plain, expensive, perfectly sized. Seraphina didn't ask how they knew her measurements. She dressed and went downstairs and found Damian Volkov sitting at a long wooden table, reading something on a tablet, while a man in a dark suit stood nearby, speaking quietly in that same unfamiliar language. Volkov looked up when she entered. "Did you sleep?" "Some." He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. The coffee was strong and dark, and exactly what she needed, something bitter that demanded nothing from her except consumption. "I've had my attorney review the documents you signed," Volkov said. "Preliminary analysis confirms what I told you last night. Your name is attached to 3 shell entities used to move approximately $94 million through construction contracts that never existed." $94 million. The number sat in the air between them like a live grenade. "If federal investigators follow the paper trail, it leads to you," he continued. "Not Nolan. The signatures are yours. The accounts were opened using your social security number and identification documents. He didn't need to forge anything. You provided everything willingly. The documents were structured so that the criminal exposure was embedded in language designed to look like standard financial housekeeping. It was professionally done. His legal team has been planning this for at least 2 years. 2 years. She did the math. 2 years ago, Nolan had started coming home later, started sleeping in the guest room, started looking at her across dinner tables with the distant appraisal of a man calculating the depreciation of an asset. She thought it was the affair. She thought Celeste was the betrayal. Celeste was nothing. Celeste was set decoration. The real betrayal was happening in boardrooms and law offices, while Seraphina hosted charity events and smiled for cameras and played the role of a wife so well she forgot it was a role. "What are my options?" she asked. Volkov set down his tablet. "Legally? Almost none. You could retain counsel and attempt to prove the signatures were obtained through misrepresentation, but that would take years and resources you don't currently have. Nolan's team will bury you in motions and discovery requests. You'd be bankrupt before the first hearing." "And illegally?" The question came out of her mouth before she'd fully decided to ask it. It hung between them. Volkov's expression didn't change. "That," he said, "depends on how far you're willing to go." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The ceramic was hot against her palms. She thought about Nolan's face in the penthouse, the cufflinks, the flat administrative tone of his voice as he dismantled her life. "You were never good enough for this world." She looked at Damian Volkov, a man whose name made powerful people flinch, whose empire was built on the kind of transactions that happened in rooms without windows. She understood what sitting at this table meant. She understood that accepting his help would come with obligations she couldn't yet see and costs she couldn't yet calculate. But she also understood, with the cold clarity that comes only after everything you thought was real turns out to be a lie, that the legal system was designed by men like Nolan, for men like Nolan, and that the rules she'd followed her entire life had never protected her. They had only made her easier to destroy. "I'm not asking you to save me," she said. "I'm asking you to teach me how to fight back." Something moved behind Volkov's eyes. Not surprise. She had the sense that very little surprised this man. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that he was looking at someone who had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. "It won't be clean," he said. I'm past clean." He held her gaze for a long beat. Then he reached for his tablet, opened a file, and turned it toward her. On the screen was a web of names, companies, transactions, and government contacts. A map of Nolan Pierce's hidden empire laid out with surgical precision. It was the anatomy of a fraud, and it was comprehensive in a way that told her Volkov hadn't assembled it overnight. He'd been watching Nolan for a long time, waiting. And now he had the perfect weapon. Her. "We start here," he said, pointing to a name near the top of the diagram. "This is the man who manages Nolan's offshore accounts. His name is Gerald Wynn, and in 6 weeks he has a meeting with regulators that will determine whether a federal investigation moves forward or dies in committee." Seraphina stared at the screen. The names and numbers blurred and reformed, and she felt something reshaping inside her. Not healing, not yet, but a restructuring, like a broken bone being set. It hurt, but it was pointing in the right direction. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Volkov leaned back in his chair. The gray light from the windows fell across his face, and she noticed a scar she hadn't seen the night before, thin, white, running along his jawline from ear to chin. A history written in skin. "Everything you know about your husband's business, every conversation you overheard, every name, every dinner guest, every late-night phone call. 9 years of marriage to a man who thought you weren't paying attention." He paused. "Were you?" She thought about it. Really thought about it. The fundraisers where she'd stood 3 feet from conversations about zoning deals and construction bids. The study door left ajar while Nolan argued with his CFO about restructuring timelines. The notebook she'd once found in his desk drawer, filled with figures and initials she hadn't understood. "More than he thinks," she said quietly. Volkov nodded once. The gesture carried the weight of a signed contract. Outside, the city was waking up. Traffic sounds filtered through the thick walls. Somewhere in a penthouse across town, Nolan Pierce was probably drinking his morning espresso, checking his portfolio, confirming that the loose end named Seraphina Vale had been successfully cut and discarded. He had no idea that she was sitting across from the one man in Blackthorn City who had the resources, the intelligence network, and the ruthlessness to take him apart. And he had no idea that the woman he'd thrown away was about to become the architect of his destruction. Seraphina set down her coffee. Her hands had stopped shaking. "When do we start?" she asked. Volkov closed the tablet and stood. "We already have." He walked toward a door at the far end of the room, and she followed him. Into a corridor lined with reinforced steel, past security checkpoints and locked rooms humming with servers and monitors. She didn't know what waited on the other side, but she knew one thing with a certainty that felt like bone. She was never going back to the rain. The room behind the reinforced door was not what Seraphina expected. She'd imagined something cinematic, walls covered in surveillance photographs, red strings connecting pushpins on a map, the aesthetic of a conspiracy thriller. Instead, it was a converted warehouse space with concrete floors, industrial lighting, and 6 long tables arranged in parallel rows. Each table held monitors, hard drives, and filing systems organized with the precision of a military operation. 3 people worked at different stations, 2 men and a woman, and none of them looked up when Volkov entered. They'd been trained not to. This was the machine. Over the following 6 weeks, Seraphina learned how it operated. Volkov's organization didn't function like the crime syndicates she'd seen in movies. There were no shouted orders, no dramatic confrontations in smoke-filled rooms. It ran like a corporation, quiet, departmentalized, efficient. Information moved through encrypted channels. Decisions were documented. Every operation had a timeline, a budget, and an exit strategy. The violence was there, we'll say she wasn't naive enough to pretend otherwise, but it was contained, strategic, deployed only when every other option had been exhausted. And at the center of it all was Damian Volkov, who managed his empire the way a surgeon manages an operating room, with absolute control, minimal conversation, and zero tolerance for wasted motion. He assigned Marin as Seraphina's primary contact. For the first 2 weeks, their sessions felt like interrogations. Marin sat across from her with a legal pad and a digital recorder, asking questions that seemed random but weren't. The dinner party on March 14, 2021, Nolan's study. Who was in the room when the phone call came in? I don't. That was 3 years ago. You were wearing a green dress. You'd had 2 glasses of Sancerre. Nolan asked you to bring a bottle of water to his study. When you opened the door, he was on the phone. Who was he talking to? Seraphina closed her eyes. The memory surfaced slowly, rising through murky water. The door. The desk lamp. Nolan's back turned, his voice low and clipped. Tell Gerald the Cayman structure needs to be operational before the Q2 filing. Gerald, she said. Gerald Wynn. What else did he say? Something about a filing, Q2, and a structure, Cayman structure. Marin wrote without looking up. Good. Now, the fundraiser at the Blackthorn Grand, September 2022. You were seated next to a man with a gray beard and a pin on his lapel, city seal. Did Nolan introduce him? This went on for hours, days. Seraphina's memory, which she'd always considered unremarkable, turned out to be a vault. 9 years of standing 3 feet from conversations she wasn't supposed to hear. 9 years of names dropped at dinner tables, phone calls taken in adjacent rooms, documents left open on laptop screens while Nolan stepped away to refill his scotch. She'd absorbed it all without knowing, the way a sponge absorbs water. Passively, completely, without any understanding of how much it held until someone started to squeeze. By the end of the 3rd week, Marin had filled 4 legal pads, and the digital recorder held over 40 hours of testimony. She brought the material to Volkov, and Seraphina watched his face as he reviewed it. He read the way he did everything, with a stillness that bordered on predatory, his eyes tracking lines of text the way a hawk tracks movement in grass. This is better than I anticipated, he said. Not to Seraphina, to Marin, as though Seraphina were a tool that had exceeded specifications rather than a person who had just spent 3 weeks excavating the most painful period of her life. It stung. She didn't show it. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark guest room, her room now, she supposed, though the word felt borrowed, and listened to the security patrols and the distant hum of the city. Her feet had healed. The cuts had closed into thin pink lines that would fade in a month. But something else was opening up. A fissure between who she had been and who she was becoming, and the gap was widening faster than she could map it. She got up at 2 a.m. and walked downstairs. The main floor was dim, lit only by the blue glow of monitors in the operations room. She expected to find it empty. Volkov was sitting at one of the long tables, jacket off, sleeves rolled to his elbows, reading from a stack of documents. A glass of something clear sat untouched beside him. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment his face was unguarded. Not the controlled mask he wore during daylight hours, but something rawer. Fatigue, maybe. Or the particular loneliness of people who run things that can never be discussed. "Can't sleep," she said. "Neither can I. Occupational hazard." She sat across from him without being invited. He didn't object. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "You've been watching Nolan for years. You have files on him that go back longer than our marriage. You had the resources to take him down any time you wanted." She folded her hands on the table. "So why didn't you?" Volkov set down the document he'd been reading. He picked up the glass, turned it once in his fingers, then set it down again without drinking. Because taking down Nolan Pierce was never the objective. Nolan is a connector. He links legitimate finance to people who operate outside the law. People I've been tracking for a long time. Remove Nolan too early, and those connections scatter. The network goes underground. I lose visibility. So you needed him in place. I needed him comfortable, confident, expanding. The more he grew, the more he exposed. Volkov's eyes met hers. And then he made a mistake. What mistake? You. The word hung in the air between them. Seraphina felt it land somewhere behind her ribs. Explain that. Nolan spent 9 years building a financial architecture designed to survive federal scrutiny. Every account, every shell company, every offshore structure was layered with enough plausible deniability to withstand an audit. It was good work, careful work. But the divorce changed the equation. He transferred liability to you because he needed a fall person, and in doing so, he created a trail that an insider could map. Someone who was there. Someone who heard the conversations, saw the documents, recognized the names. He paused. Someone with nothing left to lose. Me. You. She absorbed this. The calculation behind his kindness, if kindness was even the right word, was now fully visible. He hadn't pulled her from the rain out of compassion. He'd recognized an opportunity. A woman who possessed exactly the testimony he needed, delivered to him by the arrogance of the man he was hunting. She should have been angry. Part of her was. But a larger part, the part that had spent 3 weeks watching how power actually worked, stripped of its polite disguises, understood. This was how the world operated at the level where Volkov lived. Every relationship was a transaction. Every kindness was an investment. The only question was whether the terms were honest. "You could have told me this from the beginning," she said. "Would you have stayed?" She thought about it. Standing in the rain, bleeding, phone dead, no money, no allies, no plan. Would she have gotten into the SUV if he'd said, "I need you as a witness against your ex-husband in exchange for shelter and protection"? "Yes," she said. "I would have." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or the recalibration that comes when a person turns out to be harder than expected. "Then I should have told you," he said. It was as close to an apology as she would get from him. She took it. The weeks that followed changed Seraphina in ways she could feel, but not yet name. Volkov began including her in operational briefings. Not all of them, but enough that she could see the shape of what they were building. The case against Nolan was a mosaic assembled from hundreds of fragments: financial records, intercepted communications, testimony from former employees who'd been quietly extracted from Nolan's orbit and given incentives to cooperate. But the centerpiece was Gerald Wynn. Wynn was Nolan's financial architect, a 62-year-old accountant with a face like a boiled egg and the moral flexibility of a garden hose. He'd designed the shell company network, managed the offshore accounts, and handled the money flows that connected Nolan's legitimate development business to a constellation of criminal enterprises. Without Wynn's testimony, the case against Nolan was circumstantial. With it, the case was airtight. The problem was getting Wynn to flip. "He's terrified of Nolan," Marin said during a briefing. More specifically, he's terrified of what happens to his family if he cooperates. Nolan's made threats, indirect, obviously, through intermediaries, but Wynne got the message. Volkov leaned back in his chair. What's his vulnerability? His daughter, Emily Wynne, 28, lives in Portland. She has no idea what her father does. Wynne's biggest fear isn't prison. It's Emily finding out. Seraphina spoke before she'd decided to. I know, Gerald. The room went quiet. Marin looked at her. Volkov's eyes narrowed. He came to the house, Seraphina continued. Not often. 4, maybe 5 times over 9 years. Always during the day, when Nolan thought I was out. But twice I came home early and Gerald was in the study. He was nervous around me. Sweated through his shirt collar. Couldn't make eye contact. Did you speak with him? Small talk. He asked about the garden once. I offered him coffee. She paused. He called me ma'am every time. Like I was someone who mattered. Nolan never let anyone call me that. Volkov studied her for a long moment. Could you talk to him? You mean could I convince him to betray the man he's spent 15 years protecting? Yes. She considered the weight of what was being asked. Not just a conversation, a manipulation. Using Gerald Wynne's decency, his guilt, his fear for his daughter as leverage to break him open. It was the kind of thing Nolan would do, the kind of thing she'd spent 9 years watching from the other side. Yes, she said, I can talk to him. The meeting was arranged for a Tuesday afternoon in a cafe on the east side of the city. Neutral territory, civilian setting, no visible security. Seraphina arrived 20 minutes early and sat at a corner table with a view of both exits. She'd learned that from Marin. Always know where the doors are. Gerald Wynne arrived at 2:07, 7 minutes late and sweating despite the mild weather. He was smaller than she remembered. A compact man with thinning hair and thick glasses that magnified his eyes into something perpetually startled. He saw her and stopped 3 steps inside the door, his briefcase gripped in both hands like a shield. Mrs. Pierce, he said, it's Vale now, Seraphina. He sat across from her with the careful movements of a man lowering himself into water he suspects is too hot. His fingers drummed the table. His coffee arrived and he wrapped both hands around the cup without drinking. I shouldn't be here, he said, but you are. You said it was important. You said... He lowered his voice. You said it was about the accounts. Gerald. She leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, the way you lean toward someone you're trying to help. I know what Nolan did. I know what you helped him do. And I know that my name is on documents I never understood because you built them to be misunderstood. His face lost 2 shades of color. The drumming stopped. That wasn't Mrs. Vale. I was following instructions. I didn't know he would... You didn't know he would use me as a scapegoat? Or you didn't want to know? He looked down at the table. His jaw worked silently, the muscles bunching and releasing beneath skin that had gone the color of uncooked pastry. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Both. Gerald, federal investigators are going to follow that paper trail. When they do, it leads to me. Not to Nolan, not to you. To the woman who signed the papers without reading them because she trusted her husband. I know. You know. She let the words sit. And you're okay with that? I'm not okay with any of it. His eyes were wet behind the thick lenses. I haven't slept through the night in 4 years. My doctor put me on blood pressure medication. My wife thinks it's work stress. He laughed. A short, broken sound. She's not wrong. Then help me fix it. You don't understand what he'll do. If I talk, if anyone thinks I'm cooperating, he has people. Not the kind you call for legal advice. The kind you call when you want someone to disappear. Seraphina reached across the table and placed her hand on his wrist. His skin was clammy and his pulse was hammering beneath her fingertips. She could feel his terror like a physical temperature. I know exactly what kind of people he has, she said. I know because I'm sitting across from someone who has more of them, and better ones. Gerald stared at her. Behind the fear, she could see the accountant's brain working, calculating risks, weighing probabilities, running the numbers on survival. Who are you working with? He asked. Someone who can protect you. And Emily. The name hit him like a slap. His hand jerked beneath hers and his breath stuttered. You don't bring her into this. She's already in it, Gerald. The moment Nolan decides you're a liability, everyone you love becomes collateral. You know that. You've known it for years. She squeezed his wrist once, then released it. The only question is whether you get ahead of it or let it happen. He sat there for a long time. The cafe hummed around them. Espresso machines, quiet conversations, the clink of ceramic. Normal sounds from a normal world that neither of them inhabited anymore. "What would I have to do?" he asked. "Tell the truth. All of it. Every account, every transfer, every conversation. In exchange, you and Emily get protection. New identities if necessary. The kind of protection that doesn't expire. And the person you're working with, this protector, what does he get?" "Nolan Pierce." Gerald removed his glasses and pressed his thumb and forefinger into his eye sockets. Without the lenses, his face looked naked and old and terribly afraid. "I need time," he said. "You have 72 hours. After that, the regulatory meeting happens and the window closes." She stood, left cash on the table for the coffee neither of them had touched, and walked out of the cafe into the gray afternoon light. Her hands were steady. Her heartbeat was even. She had just manipulated a frightened old man using his daughter as emotional leverage, and she'd done it with the calm precision of someone placing chess pieces. She wasn't sure if that made her strong or something worse. Marin was waiting in a car across the street. Seraphina got in and closed the door. "How did it go?" "He'll call within 48 hours. "You're sure?" Seraphina watched the cafe entrance through the window. Gerald was still inside, sitting alone, his head in his hands. "I'm sure." Back at the compound, she found Volkov in the operations room reviewing surveillance footage. He paused the feed when she entered, a gesture of attention she'd learned to read as his version of respect. "Wynn is considering it," she said. "He's scared, but he's more scared of doing nothing. I give him 2 days." Volkov nodded. "Good work." The compliment should have felt like progress. Instead, it felt like a door closing behind her. Another step deeper into a corridor she couldn't navigate backward through. She'd come here as a victim. She was becoming something else. An operative. An instrument. A weapon shaped from the wreckage of a woman who used to arrange flowers for dinner parties. "I need to ask you something else," she said. Volkov waited. "The night you picked me up, you said Nolan was a connector, that he linked legitimate finance to people outside the law. You said you'd been tracking those people." "Yes." "Who are they?" The silence that followed was different from the comfortable pauses she'd grown accustomed to. This one had weight, texture, the quality of a locked door being tested. "That's not information you need right now," he said. "If I'm going to be part of this operation, I need to understand what I'm standing in the middle of." "You're part of the Nolan Pierce operation. That's one layer of a larger structure. The other layers don't concern you." "They concern me if they can get me killed." His jaw tightened. It was subtle, a fractional adjustment in the musculature of his face, but she'd been studying him for weeks and she caught it. She'd touched something he didn't want touched. "There's a man named Victor Sorin," Volkov said finally. "He controls narcotics distribution across the eastern seaboard. He launders revenue through construction, real estate, and government contracts. For the last 4 years, Nolan Pierce has been one of his primary channels." The name meant nothing to her, but the architecture of the information was clear. Nolan wasn't just a white-collar criminal hiding money. He was embedded in something enormous, a network that stretched far beyond real estate fraud and shell companies into territories where the currency wasn't money, but violence. Does Nolan know what Victor Sorin actually is? Nolan knows exactly what Victor Sorin is. He's been laundering Sorin's drug revenue through his development projects since 2020. The construction contracts that don't exist, the ones your name is attached to, those aren't just tax fraud vehicles. They're cleaning operations for narcotics money. The room seemed to contract around her. The monitors hummed. Somewhere in the compound, a door opened and closed. "So when the federal investigation hits," she said slowly, "it won't just be financial fraud. No. It'll be drug trafficking, money laundering for a cartel. Yes. And my name is on those documents. Yes." She stood up from this table so abruptly that the chair scraped against concrete with a sound like a shout. She walked to the window and pressed her palms against the cold glass and stared at the courtyard below, where 2 men in dark jackets were having a cigarette break beside the armored vehicles. "You knew this," she said without turning around. "From the beginning. You knew my exposure wasn't just financial fraud, you knew it was trafficking, and you didn't tell me. I told you what you needed to know at each stage. That's not the same as telling me the truth. The truth would have paralyzed you. You needed to act. She spun around. Don't you dare tell me what I needed. I spent 9 years with a man who decided what I needed to know, who controlled the information I received, who shaped my reality to serve his purposes. And now you're sitting there doing the exact same thing with better intentions and a different accent. The words landed. She could see them hit, a micro flinch around his eyes, the slight parting of his lips as though he'd started a response and aborted it. Damian Volkov, the man who made powerful people flinch, had just been struck by a woman who weighed 120 pounds and owned nothing but borrowed clothes. You're right, he said. She hadn't expected that. She'd braced for deflection, justification, the cold logic of operational necessity, not concession. From this point forward, he said, you get full access. Everything. The Soren files, the operational timelines, the risk assessments, all of it. Why? Because I asked nicely? Because you're not the person who walked in 6 weeks ago. That person needed to be managed. You don't. She didn't know if it was a compliment or an admission that she'd crossed into territory where management was no longer possible. Both, probably. Her phone buzzed. The new one Volkov's people had provided, encrypted, untraceable. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. A text message with no words. Just a photograph. It was a picture of her, taken from across the street outside the cafe where she'd met Gerald Wynn. She was walking to Marin's car. The angle suggested a telephoto lens. Professional. The timestamp was 2 hours ago. Beneath the photo, a single line of text. We know where you are. We know what you're doing. Tell Volkov his pet project just became very expensive. She held the phone out to Volkov. He took it, looked at the image, and his expression underwent a transformation she'd never seen before. The controlled stillness didn't break. It intensified, the way metal hardens when you cool it rapidly. Every trace of warmth or concession vanished from his face, replaced by something that made the air in the room feel thinner. He made a single phone call, spoke 4 words in that language she still couldn't identify. Then he looked at her. Nolan knows, he said quietly, which means Victor Soren knows, which means everything we've built in the last 6 weeks just became a war. The compound alarms activated 30 seconds later, a low, pulsing tone that vibrated through the concrete walls like a heartbeat. Through the window, Seraphina watched security teams move across the courtyard with practiced urgency, weapons visible, perimeters tightening. And standing in the center of that controlled chaos, she understood with absolute clarity that the line between revenge and survival had just been erased. There was no going back. There had never been a way back. There was only forward, into whatever was coming, whatever it cost, whatever it turned her into. She looked at Volkov. He was already watching her, waiting for the fear to surface, waiting for her to break. She didn't. Tell me the plan, she said. And for the first time since she'd known him, Damian Volkov looked at her not as an asset, not as a tool, not as a weapon shaped from someone else's wreckage, but as a partner standing at the edge of something that could destroy them both. The alarms continued to pulse. The city outside had gone dark, and somewhere across Blackthorn, a man named Victor Soren was making a phone call that would change everything. The alarms didn't stop for 47 minutes. Seraphina stood in the operations room with her back against the concrete wall and her arms crossed over her chest, watching Volkov's people work. There was no panic. That was the thing that struck her. These were people who had rehearsed catastrophe the way office workers rehearsed fire drills. Monitors cycled through exterior camera feeds. Radio chatter crackled in short, coded bursts. 2 men she hadn't seen before, heavy-set, dead-eyed, carrying weapons she couldn't name, appeared from somewhere deep inside the compound and took positions near the main entrance without being told. Volkov stood at the center table, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, rapid sentences. She caught fragments, names she didn't recognize, numbers that could have been coordinates or account codes, a tone that carried the flat authority of a man issuing orders he expected to be followed without repetition. Marin appeared at Seraphina's side. We're relocating you tonight. Pack whatever you have. It won't be much. Where? Secondary location, north of the city. You'll be briefed when we arrive. I'm not going anywhere until someone tells me what's actually happening. Marin looked at her with an expression that was half respect, half irritation. What's happening is that Victor Soren just sent a message through 3 layers of intermediaries that took our people 40 minutes to trace. The photograph of you at the cafe was taken by a professional surveillance team, not Nolan's people. No, Nolan doesn't have people like that. These are Soren's operators, military trained, the kind who take photographs before they take shots. The words hit Seraphina's bloodstream like ice water. She felt her pulse spike, felt the fine hairs on the back of her neck lift, felt her body recognize danger before her mind had finished processing the sentence. So Nolan told Soren about me. Nolan told Soren about Volkov's interest in you, which is worse. Soren doesn't care about a divorced woman. He cares about what a divorced woman can testify to. Volkov ended his call and crossed the room to them. His face had settled into something beyond calm, a geological stillness like bedrock. Whatever internal calculation he'd been running had reached its conclusion. Gerald Wynn is dead, he said. The room tilted. Seraphina's hand found the wall behind her. What? 40 minutes ago. His car went off the River Street Bridge. Single vehicle. No witnesses. Police are calling it an accident. It wasn't an accident. No. She thought of Gerald's hands wrapped around a coffee cup. The way his pulse had hammered under her fingertips. The terror in his voice when she'd mentioned Emily's name. He'd been sitting in that cafe 2 hours ago, alive, afraid, considering whether to do the right thing for the first time in 15 years. And now his body was in the river. Emily, Seraphina said. His daughter. Is she? She's safe. We had a team on her before the meeting as a precaution. She's being moved to a secure location. Does she know? She knows her father's dead. She doesn't know why. Seraphina pressed her palms flat against the wall. The concrete was cold and rough and real. She needed something real. Because the rest of this, the alarms, the dead accountant, the surveillance photographs, felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Someone who hadn't been arranging chrysanthemums in a penthouse 6 weeks ago. This changes everything, she said. Yes. Without Gerald, there's no testimony. The paper trail leads to me and stops. That's one interpretation. She looked at him sharply. What's the other? Volkov's jaw tightened, that fractional movement again. The tell she'd learned to read as the precursor to something he didn't want to say. Gerald Wynn kept copies, physical copies, ledgers, account records, transaction logs, everything he managed for Nolan dating back to 2018. He kept them as insurance, stored in a location known only to him and one other person. Who? His attorney, a woman named Judith Cross. She operates out of a private practice on the east side. So we get the records from her. It's not that simple. Judith Cross isn't just Gerald's attorney. She's been Nolan's backup legal counsel for 11 years. She has a retainer arrangement with Pierce Development that pays her $400,000 a year to do almost nothing, which means it pays her $400,000 a year to stay quiet. She works for both sides? She works for whoever pays more. Right now that's Nolan. But with Gerald dead, the insurance value of those records just increased exponentially. She knows what they're worth. She'll sell them to the highest bidder. Then we outbid Nolan. It's not about money. It's about survival. Judith Cross knows that whoever holds Gerald's records holds the power to destroy Nolan Pierce or to protect him. She also knows that Victor Soren will kill anyone who threatens Nolan's usefulness to his operation. Volkov paused. She's going to need more than a check. She's going to need a reason to believe she'll live long enough to spend it. Seraphina stared at him. You want me to go to her. She won't meet with me. She knows who I am. She knows that a meeting with Damian Volkov is a meeting she might not walk away from. But a meeting with Nolan Pierce's ex-wife, a woman who has legitimate legal standing to request documents bearing her own forged signatures, that's different. That's defensible. If anyone asks, it was a client consultation. You want me to walk into the office of a woman who works for the man trying to destroy me and the man trying to kill me, and convince her to hand over the only evidence that can save my life? Yes. And if she says no? Then the records go to Nolan, the paper trail stays pointed at you, and Victor Soren eliminates the last loose end, which is you. The compound had gone quiet. The alarms had stopped. Outside, the security teams held their positions in the dark courtyard, shadows against shadows. Seraphina could hear her own breathing, shallow, faster than she wanted it to be. The rhythm of a body that understood the mathematics of the situation, even if the mind was still catching up. When? She asked. Tomorrow. Marin will brief you tonight. He turned to leave. She stopped him with a question that came from somewhere deeper than strategy. Gerald Wynn had a coffee cup in his hands 2 hours ago. He was alive. He was scared, but he was alive. And now he's dead because I sat across from him in a cafe and asked him to be brave. Her voice didn't break. She wouldn't allow it. Is that going to happen to Judith Cross too? Volkov stood in the doorway with his back half turned. The light from the corridor fell across his profile and illuminated the scar along his jaw. That thin white line that ran from ear to chin like a sentence written in a language she was only beginning to learn. I don't know, he said. It was the most honest thing he'd ever told her. She hated him for it. They relocated at midnight. 3 vehicles, the armored SUV plus 2 escort cars, moved through Blackthorn's empty streets in a convoy that traveled without headlights for the first 6 blocks. Seraphina sat in the back seat next to Marin, watching the darkened buildings slide past like the walls of a tunnel. The secondary location was a converted boathouse on the industrial waterfront north of the city center. It smelled like diesel and salt water and old wood. The interior had been modified, Teet. Reinforced walls, blacked-out windows, a communication setup that mirrored the compound's operations room on a smaller scale. It was ugly and cold, and the plumbing made sounds like an animal in distress. But it was safe, or as safe as anything could be when Victor Soren's surveillance teams were active in the city. Marin briefed her until 3 a.m. Judith Cross's habits, schedule, vulnerabilities, the layout of her office building, the names of her assistant, her paralegal, the security guard who worked the lobby on weekday mornings, entry routes, exit routes, the location of the nearest hospital in case things went wrong in ways that required medical attention rather than legal counsel. You go in at 9:15, Marin said. Her first appointment is at 10 o'clock. That gives you 45 minutes. You identify yourself, establish legal standing to request documents bearing your signature, and determine whether she's willing to negotiate. And if she's already contacted Nolan, then you leave immediately. Don't argue. Don't try to convince her. If Nolan knows you're coming, the meeting is a trap, and the objective shifts from persuasion to survival. You walk out, you get in the car, we extract. Seraphina nodded. Her hands were steady. She noticed that and found it strange, this calm that had settled over her like frost, numbing the surface while something hot and dangerous continued to burn underneath. One more thing, Marin said. She hesitated, which was unusual for her. Marin didn't hesitate. Volkov didn't tell you everything about Victor Soren. Seraphina's eyes narrowed. What didn't he tell me? Soren and Volkov have history. Not business history. Personal. 15 years ago, Soren controlled this city's eastern corridor, drugs, weapons, labor trafficking. Volkov built his organization by dismantling Soren's territory piece by piece. There were casualties on both sides. Soren lost a brother in the conflict. Volkov lost... Marin stopped. Her mouth thinned into a line. It doesn't matter what he lost. What matters is that this isn't just an operation for him. It hasn't been for a long time. Boss sat bapdi potporsi. You're telling me this is personal. I'm telling you that when Damian Volkov looks at Victor Soren, he doesn't see a strategic objective. He sees the thing that took something from him that he never got back. And men who fight personal wars make mistakes that men fighting strategic ones don't. Why are you telling me this? Because tomorrow you're walking into a room that exists at the intersection of Volkov's war and Nolan's survival and Soren's paranoia, and you deserve to know that the man sending you in there isn't operating with a clear head. Seraphina studied Marin's face. Competent, direct, loyal to Volkov in the way that long-serving soldiers are loyal to their commanders. Not blindly, but with the accumulated weight of shared experience. And right now, that loyalty was being stretched by something that looked like concern. Not for Volkov. For Seraphina. Thank you, Seraphina said. Marin stood and gathered her briefing materials. Don't thank me. Just come back alive. She didn't sleep. She sat on the narrow cot in the boathouse's upper room and listened to the water lapping against the pilings and tried to feel something she could use. Fear was there, but it had become ambient, a background frequency she'd stopped consciously hearing. Anger was there too, but it had refined itself over 6 weeks into something more controlled. Not a blaze, a blowtorch. Precise, directional, capable of cutting through specific materials. What she felt most, sitting in the dark at 4 in the morning on the eve of the most dangerous thing she'd ever done, was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when every irrelevant thing has been burned away and all that remains is the shape of what you actually are. She was a woman who had been used by 2 different men for 2 different purposes, and she had allowed it both times because she needed what they offered more than she needed her own autonomy. Nolan had offered her a life. Volkov had offered her vengeance, and she had signed on both dotted lines without fully reading the terms. But Gerald Wynn was dead. And his death, the sound his car must have made hitting the water, the darkness that must have flooded the interior as the river closed over the windshield, that death was a consequence of her action. Her choice to sit across from him, her manipulation, her careful, calculated deployment of his daughter's name as a lever against his resistance. She had done that. Not Nolan, not Volkov. Her, the woman who used to arrange flowers, was gone. The woman sitting on this cot had Gerald Wynn's blood on her hands, metaphorically, technically, practically. And in the morning she would walk into another room and attempt to bend another frightened person to her will, because the alternative was a federal prison cell or a body in the river. This was what she had become. She waited for the horror of it to surface. It didn't, and that, she understood, was the most terrifying thing of all. Morning came gray and flat. The sky over the waterfront the color of wet cement. Seraphina dressed in the clothes Marin had provided. Dark, professional, unremarkable. She looked at herself in the narrow bathroom mirror and saw a woman she was still learning to recognize. Hard around the eyes, lean from weeks of stress-diminished appetite, carrying herself with a stillness she'd borrowed from Volkov without noticing. The car took her to the east side of the city at 8:50. She arrived at Judith Cross's building at 9:12 and sat in the lobby for 3 minutes, watching the security guard behind the front desk, the elevator bank, the position of the cameras. Everything matched Marin's briefing. She rode the elevator to the 7th floor. The hallway was carpeted and quiet, smelling of printer toner and stale coffee. Suite 714, a frosted glass door with gold lettering, Cross Legal Services. She opened the door. The reception area was small. A desk, a couch, a water cooler, framed diplomas on the walls. The assistant behind the desk was a young man with careful hair and an expression that suggested he'd been told to expect her. "Ms. Vale?" "Yes." "Ms. Cross will see you now." The office beyond was larger than the reception area suggested. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's east side, where the skyline thinned into row houses and industrial lots. Bookshelves lined with legal volumes. A mahogany desk that dominated the room like an altar. Behind it sat Judith Cross. She was not what Seraphina expected, not the sharp-edged corporate shark she'd imagined. Judith Cross was somewhere in her mid-50s, heavy-set, with short silver hair and reading glasses perched on the end of a nose that had been broken at least once. She looked like someone's favorite aunt, the one who brought casseroles to funerals and told dirty jokes when the children weren't listening. She looked kind, but her eyes were the eyes of a woman who had survived 3 decades in a profession that ate kind people alive. Brown, steady, missing nothing. "Sit down, Ms. Vale." Seraphina sat. "You're here about Gerald. You know what happened to him. I know his car went off a bridge. I know it wasn't an accident. And I know that you met with him 2 hours before it happened, which means you're either responsible for his death or you're the reason someone else decided he needed to die." Judith folded her hands on the desk. "Which is it?" "I asked him to cooperate against Nolan Pierce. Someone found out." "Someone?" Judith's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Let's not be coy. Victor Soren found out, because Nolan Pierce, who is, incidentally, still my client, told him that Damian Volkov is using you as a battering ram against his financial infrastructure, and Soren decided the fastest way to plug the leak was to remove the plumber." "You know about the records Gerald kept." "Of course I know. I'm his attorney. I'm the custodian of those records." "Then you know what they contain." "I know exactly what they contain, Ms. Vale. Every transaction Gerald managed for Nolan over 15 years. Every shell company, every offshore account, every signature set, including yours. They're comprehensive enough to put Nolan Pierce in prison for the rest of his natural life. They're also comprehensive enough to prove that you were an unwitting participant rather than a co-conspirator, which is why you're sitting in that chair right now. Seraphina felt her heart rate climb. The records existed. They were real. And the woman holding them had just laid out their value with the precision of an auctioneer. I need those records, Judith. I imagine you do. So does Nolan. So does Volkov. So does Victor Soren, though his preferred method of acquisition involves less conversation and more violence. She removed her glasses and set them on the desk. Here's the problem. Gerald is dead. His estate hasn't been settled. The records are held in a secure facility under attorney-client privilege, which survives the death of the client. I'm under no legal obligation to release them to anyone. You're also under no legal obligation to stay alive once Soren decides those records are a threat. The words came out harder than Seraphina intended. Judith's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the quality of her attention. A tightening, the way a rope tightens when weight is applied. Is that a threat, Ms. Vale? It's arithmetic. Gerald Wynn knew things that could hurt Soren's operation. Gerald Wynn is dead. You know the same things. How long do you think the arithmetic takes to reach you? Judith was quiet for a moment. Outside, a truck horn blared on the street below and faded into the general noise of the city. You're different from what I expected, she said. I knew you as Nolan's wife, the pretty one who stood behind him at press conferences and smiled like she meant it. I always wondered if you were stupid or just patient. She tapped one finger against the desk. Now I know. Will you release the records? Not to you, not to Volkov, and not to Nolan. She stood and walked to the window, her broad back silhouetted against the gray light. I've arranged for the records to be transferred to a third party, a federal contact I trust, someone outside of Soren's reach. If anything happens to me, the transfer executes automatically. If nothing happens, I control the timing. You're using them as a dead man's switch. I'm using them to stay alive, Ms. Vale, which is something you should understand better than most. She turned back. Go home. Tell Volkov I'm not his to acquire. Tell him the records will reach the right hands when I decide the time is right, and not a day before. Seraphina stood. Her legs felt wooden. The meeting was slipping away from her. The leverage she'd walked in with was dissolving like sugar in water. Judith, if Soren gets to you before you trigger the transfer, then the records go to the federal contact automatically. That's what dead man switch means. And if Soren gets to the federal contact first, Judith's face went very still. What did you say? Victor Soren has people inside federal agencies. Volkov has confirmed it. If your trusted contact is compromised, if Soren already knows who they are, the blood drained from Judith's face in real time. Seraphina watched it happen. The color withdrawing from her cheeks, like a tide retreating from a shore, leaving behind the gray, exposed terrain of raw fear. That's not... Gerald vetted him. He's been reliable for... Gerald is dead, Judith. His judgment died with him. Judith sat back down heavily. Her hands found the edge of the desk and gripped it. The reading glasses lay forgotten beside her elbow. For the first time, the competent, sardonic, unflappable attorney looked exactly like what she was. A 60-year-old woman sitting on a bomb she couldn't defuse, surrounded by people who wanted what she had and were willing to kill for it. What do you want? She whispered. A copy of the records. Not the originals. You keep those for your insurance. A copy delivered to me within 24 hours. In exchange, Volkov provides protection for you. Real protection. The kind that kept Emily Wynn alive when her father didn't survive the night. Judith's eyes searched hers, looking for the lie, the trap, the hidden clause. Seraphina held her gaze and let her look. There was nothing to hide. The terms were exactly what they appeared to be. A transaction between two women who understood that the men around them had turned the world into a chessboard, and the only way to survive was to stop being pieces and start being players. 24 hours, Judith said. Seraphina nodded and walked to the door. Her hand was on the handle when Judith spoke again. Ms. Vale, she turned. Nolan called me this morning, before you arrived. The floor dropped beneath Seraphina's feet. He knows you're here. He's known since last night. And he didn't try to stop you because he wanted you to come. Judith's voice had gone flat and colorless, emptied of everything but the delivery of information. This meeting was never your play. It was his. He let you walk in here because he wanted to see who you'd reach for next, who Volkov would send after Gerald's records. He wanted confirmation that the records are the linchpin. Seraphina's hand tightened on the door handle until the metal bit into her palm. And now he has it, Judith said. You just showed him exactly where to aim. The walk from Judith's office to the elevator took 12 seconds. Seraphina counted them the way she'd counted the minutes standing on the penthouse marble 6 weeks ago. Automatically, mechanically, the mind clinging to numbers because everything else had come unmoored. She'd been played. Not by Soren, not by Volkov, by Nolan. The man she'd been married to for 9 years, the man she'd dismissed as a cunning but ultimately predictable financial predator, had outmaneuvered her with the same elegant simplicity he'd used to forge her signatures on $94 million of fraudulent contracts. He hadn't tried to stop her because stopping her would have been crude. Instead, he'd watched. He'd let her move. And her movement had told him everything he needed to know. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. The doors closed. She was alone in a metal box descending 7 floors, and the woman staring back at her from the polished steel doors was someone she barely recognized, hard-eyed, pale, vibrating with a rage so concentrated it felt structural, like a crack running through a load-bearing wall. Nolan hadn't just anticipated her move. He'd anticipated Volkov's, which meant Nolan understood the game better than either of them had believed, which meant the frightened, cornered, desperate man they'd been hunting for 6 weeks had never been frightened or cornered or desperate at all. He'd been waiting. The lobby, the car, Marin behind the wheel, engine running. How did it go? Drive. Seraphina, drive, now, and call Volkov. Tell him we've been compromised. Tell him Nolan is 3 steps ahead of us. She buckled her seatbelt with hands that had finally started to shake. Tell him everything we've done for 6 weeks has been exactly what Nolan wanted us to do. Marin pulled into traffic without another word. And somewhere across Blackthorn City, in a corner office overlooking the skyline he still owned, Nolan Pierce set down his phone, straightened his cuffs, and smiled the way a man smiles when every piece on the board is exactly where he put it. Marin drove 14 blocks before Seraphina stopped shaking. Not from fear. From the specific corrosive fury of a person who has just discovered that the ground they've been standing on was designed to collapse. She sat in the passenger seat with her hands clamped between her knees, pressing them together until the bones ached, using the pain as a focal point because without it, the rage would have nowhere to go and she'd start screaming in a moving vehicle. Marin had Volkov on speaker. His voice filled the car, flat, controlled, but Seraphina could hear the tension beneath it like a wire being wound too tight. Tell me exactly what Cross said. Every word. Seraphina told him. The records. The dead man's switch. The federal contact. And then the part that mattered. The part that had turned 6 weeks of careful strategy into a trap they'd walked into with their eyes open. He let me go to her, Seraphina said. He knew I'd come. He wanted confirmation that Gerald's records were the target, and I handed it to him on a plate. Silence on the line. 3 seconds. 5. The sound of Volkov breathing through his nose, slow, deliberate, the breathing of a man holding something volatile in check. Come back to the boathouse, he said. We regroup. Regroup. She almost laughed. Nolan is ahead of us. He's been ahead of us the entire time. While we were congratulating ourselves on being clever, he was watching us be exactly as clever as he needed us to be. Come back. Now. The line went dead. Marin glanced at her. He's not angry at you. I don't care who he's angry at. They reached the boathouse at 10:40 a.m. Volkov was standing in the center of the operations room when they entered, and the temperature of the space had changed. The 2 technicians who normally worked the monitoring stations were absent. The screens were dark except for one, which displayed a single image, a financial flowchart Seraphina recognized as Nolan's shell company network. Volkov looked at her. His face was a mask of controlled stillness, but his eyes were wrong, darker than usual, carrying a heat that didn't match the frost of his expression. She'd seen this before in small doses. Now it filled the room like pressure before a storm. Sit down, he said. She didn't sit. She stood 6 feet from him with her arms crossed and waited. I've made a call, he said. The Blackthorn Grand Foundation Gala is in 72 hours. Every major player in this city will be in that ballroom. Investors, politicians, federal officials, media. Nolan will be there. His board will be there. He paused. Victor Soren's people will be there. And? We're going. Seraphina stared at him. We're going to the gala. The same gala that Nolan is using as his victory lap. The event where he'll be surrounded by security, allies, and every power broker in Blackthorn. Yes. That's insane. That's the only move left. Volkov stepped toward the monitor and pointed to 3 names highlighted in red on the flow chart. Judith Cross gave you something she didn't intend to give. She confirmed the records exist, she confirmed their location is tied to her dead man's switch, and she confirmed she has a federal contact. What she didn't tell you is that the contact's name is already in our files. He tapped the screen. A photograph appeared. A man in his 50s with a lined face and the careful haircut of a career bureaucrat. Raymond Ash, Deputy Director of the Financial Crimes Division. He's been on Soren's payroll for 3 years. He's compromised. Completely. Which means Judith's dead man's switch is pointing at a man who will bury the records the moment they arrive. Her insurance policy is worthless. She just doesn't know it yet. Seraphina's mind was racing. The architecture of the trap was becoming visible. Not just Nolan's trap, but the larger structure that connected Nolan to Soren to the federal infrastructure that was supposed to be the last line of accountability. Every exit was sealed. Every failsafe was corrupted. The system that should have caught Nolan years ago was the same system that protected him. So we can't use the legal route, she said. The records are compromised. The federal contact is compromised. And Nolan knows we're coming. Which is exactly why we go to the gala. Explain it to me. Because right now it sounds like you're walking us into a room full of enemies and calling it a strategy. Volkov turned from the screen. His shoulders were rigid beneath his shirt, and she could see the cords of tension in his neck. The physical evidence of a man holding himself together through force of will. Nolan's strength is control. He controls the narrative, the legal infrastructure, the flow of information. Every move we've made has fed into his system because we were playing on his board. The gala changes the board. How? Because I'm going to give him something he doesn't expect. Something that breaks his control completely. What? Volkov reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a flash drive. Small, black, unremarkable. He held it between his thumb and forefinger. For the last 3 years, my organization has been compiling a parallel record of every transaction Nolan Pierce has conducted through Victor Soren's network. Not Gerald Wynn's records, ours. Independent surveillance, intercepted communications, financial forensics conducted by people who don't exist on any government payroll. This drive contains enough evidence to dismantle Nolan's empire, expose Soren's distribution network, and implicate Raymond Ash in the cover-up. Seraphina looked at the drive. It was small enough to disappear in a closed fist. You've had this the entire time. Yes. Then why? Why Gerald? Why the records? Why did you send me to Judith Cross if you already had what we needed? Because this evidence was obtained illegally, every piece of it. Unauthorized surveillance, hacked communications, stolen financial records. In a courtroom, it's worthless. It would be thrown out before opening arguments, and the attorneys who submitted it would face criminal charges. Then what good is it? In a courtroom? None. But at the gala, in front of 300 witnesses, broadcast through every media outlet in the city? He held up the drive. It's a bomb. Not a legal filing, a detonation. Once this information is public, once every investor, every politician, every journalist in that room sees what Nolan Pierce has been doing, the legal system won't matter. The court of public opinion will do what the courts of law were designed to prevent. The audacity of it stole her breath. Not a prosecution, an exposure. A controlled demolition of Nolan's reputation, his alliances, his carefully constructed fortress of plausible deniability, all of it detonated in real time in front of the exact audience that had the power to destroy him. That's why you need the gala, she said. It's not a venue. It's a delivery system. The largest, most prestigious gathering of power in Blackthorn City. Every camera, every microphone, every social media account in the room becomes a vector. Once the information is out, Nolan can't contain it. Soren can't contain it. No amount of legal maneuvering can put it back in the box. And Nolan? He'll know the moment you walk in what you're planning. He'll suspect, but he won't know how. And he won't be able to stop it without creating exactly the kind of scene that draws the attention I need. Seraphina studied Volkov's face. The plan was brilliant and reckless and completely terrifying, and she could see in the set of his jaw and the blaze behind his eyes that he was going to execute it regardless of whether she agreed. This was the war Marin had warned her about. Personal, visceral, driven by something older and deeper than strategy. "There's a piece you're not telling me," she said. His gaze flickered. "The tell. Victor Soren will have people at the gala. Armed people. The moment you expose Nolan's connection to his network, you're exposing Soren himself. He won't let that happen quietly." "No, he won't." "So the gala isn't just an exposure. It's a provocation. You're not just burning Nolan, you're forcing Soren to react in public, in front of cameras, in a way that makes him visible." "Yes. People could die. People have already died. Gerald Wynn died. The question isn't whether there will be casualties. The question is whether those casualties mean something or whether they disappear into the same silence that's been protecting these men for decades." She wanted to argue. She wanted to find the flaw in his logic, the gap in his reasoning that would give her permission to walk away. But the truth, the cold, geometric truth, was that he was right. The legal system was compromised. The federal agencies were bought. The records were pointed at a man who worked for the enemy. Every conventional path led to the same dead end. Nolan Pierce walks free. Seraphina Vale goes to prison or goes into the ground. And Victor Soren continues to pump narcotics through a city that has already given up trying to stop him. The gala was insane. It was also the only door left. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "I need you beside me when we walk in. Not behind me. Beside me. Every person in that room knows who Nolan Pierce's wife was. When they see you standing next to me, they'll understand immediately that the woman he discarded has come back with the one man he can't control. That image, that visual, is worth more than any speech or presentation. It's the story that sells the evidence. You need me as a symbol. I need you as a statement." She turned the word over in her mind. A statement. Not a weapon. Not a tool. Not an instrument of someone else's strategy. A declaration made by her own presence in a room full of people who had watched her be humiliated and done nothing. "I'll be there," she said. The next 72 hours were the longest of her life. Volkov's team worked around the clock, preparing for the gala with the precision of a military operation. Security assessments, entry and exit strategies, communication protocols, contingency plans for 12 different scenarios ranging from successful exposure with media pickup to armed confrontation with Soren's operatives in a crowded ballroom. Seraphina sat in on every briefing, absorbing details with the same ruthless focus she'd applied to Marin's interrogation sessions. She didn't see Volkov alone again until the night before the gala. She found him on the boathouse roof at midnight, standing at the edge overlooking the dark water. The city skyline glittered across the harbor like a circuit board, and the wind carried the smell of salt and diesel and the distant throb of nightclub bass from the entertainment district. He heard her approach but didn't turn. "You should be sleeping," he said. "So should you." She stood beside him at the railing. The metal was cold under her hands. Below them, the water slapped against the pilings in irregular rhythms, like a conversation in a language she almost understood. "Marin told me about Soren," she said. "The history between you. She said you lost someone." His hands tightened on the railing. The knuckles whitened. For a long time he said nothing, and she thought he was going to refuse the conversation entirely. Seal it behind the same reinforced door that protected everything else inside him. "My sister," he said finally. "Katya. Soren's people took her in 2011. She was 23. His voice was level, factual, reciting data, but his hands on the railing told a different story. "They used her to send me a message. The message was received. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be angry. Sorry doesn't change anything. Anger does." "Is that what tomorrow is about? Anger?" He turned to face her. In the dim light from the city, his features were all angles and shadow. The scar along his jaw, the deep-set eyes, the mouth that never quite relaxed. "Tomorrow is about finishing what I started 15 years ago. Nolan Pierce is a component. Soren is the machine. I've spent 15 years taking it apart piece by piece, and tomorrow I remove the last piece." He paused. If that makes me a man driven by anger rather than strategy, then yes, that's what I am. Marin thinks it makes you dangerous. Marin is right. I am dangerous. I've never pretended otherwise. They stood in silence for a while. The city hummed. The water moved. Somewhere a siren wailed and faded. After tomorrow, Seraphina said quietly, what happens to us? The question surprised her as much as it surprised him. She hadn't planned to ask it. It had emerged from somewhere beneath strategy and planning and survival, from the part of her that was still capable of wanting something beyond destruction. Volkov looked at her for a long time. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those nearly black eyes that missed nothing and revealed less, held something she'd never seen in them before. Something that looked, impossibly, like uncertainty. I don't know, he said. She nodded. It was enough. It was honest. She went back inside and lay on the narrow cot and listened to her own heartbeat until she fell asleep. The gala was everything she remembered and nothing she recognized. The Blackthorn Grand Ballroom occupied the top 3 floors of the city's most iconic building, a Gilded Age monument that had been renovated with enough glass and steel to satisfy modern tastes while retaining the marble columns and coffered ceilings that whispered of old money and older power. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from 40-foot ceilings. Champagne moved through the crowd on silver trays carried by servers who had been trained to be invisible. The guest list read like a census of Blackthorn's ruling class: hedge fund managers, real estate magnates, city council members, media executives, and the particular species of beautiful people who existed primarily to be photographed at events like this. Seraphina stood in the back of the armored SUV as it approached the entrance, checking her reflection in the tinted glass. The dress was gold silk, sculpted, architectural, designed to communicate power rather than beauty, though it accomplished both. Marin had sourced it from somewhere she didn't ask about. Her hair was pulled back, exposing the line of her jaw and neck. Diamond choker, red lips. She looked like a woman who had come to burn something down, and she'd dressed for the fire. Volkov sat beside her in a black tuxedo that fit him like armor. His expression was sealed. The operational mask locked into place, every trace of the man she'd spoken with on the rooftop buried beneath layers of discipline and intent. The drive is in my jacket pocket, he said. The broadcast team is in position on the 3rd floor. Once I give the signal, the contents will be transmitted simultaneously to every major media outlet in the city and projected onto the ballroom's main display screens. We'll have approximately 4 minutes before Soren's people react. 4 minutes. That's enough. The information will be public. Once it's out, it can't be taken back. And after the 4 minutes? After the 4 minutes, we leave. Quickly. The SUV stopped. The door opened. Sound flooded in. Music. Laughter. The flashbulb staccato of press photographers lining the entrance. Volkov stepped out first and extended his hand. She took it. They walked into the ballroom together, and the room noticed. Of course it noticed. Damian Volkov at a public event was unusual enough to generate attention. Damian Volkov arriving with Nolan Pierce's ex-wife was a detonation. Conversations faltered. Champagne flutes paused halfway to lips. Heads turned with the synchronized precision of a school of fish responding to a predator. Seraphina felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes settle onto her like a physical pressure. The heat of scrutiny, the electric crackle of gossip igniting in real time. She didn't flinch. She walked through it the way Volkov had taught her to walk through everything, with the understanding that the people watching were not the audience. They were the medium. The message was being transmitted through them. She spotted Nolan 40 seconds after entering the ballroom. He was standing near the east wall with a group of investors, Celeste at his side in an emerald gown that accentuated the visible curve of her pregnancy. He held a whiskey glass in his right hand and was mid-sentence when he saw Seraphina. He stopped talking. His mouth remained partially open, a fraction of a second of genuine shock that his social training couldn't quite mask before the walls went back up. Then his expression hardened into something cold and appraising, and she watched him calculate, assess the threat, evaluate the variables, determine the optimal response. He handed his glass to Celeste without looking at her and began walking toward them. "Here we go," Volkov murmured beside her. Nolan arrived with the practiced stride of a man who owned rooms. He stopped 6 feet away, close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain control of the space. Seraphina. His voice was smooth, modulated, the voice of a man giving a keynote address. This is a surprise. No, it isn't, she said, the faintest crack in his composure. A micro-expression, the tightening of the skin around his eyes that she'd learned to read over 9 years of marriage. He'd expected defiance, but not confidence. He'd prepared for anger, not calm. He shifted his attention to Volkov. Mr. Volkov, I don't believe we've been formally introduced. We haven't. And yet here you are, in my city, at my event, with my wife. Ex-wife, Seraphina said. And this isn't your event, Nolan. You're a guest, just like everyone else. Another crack. Deeper this time. She could see the machinery working behind his eyes. The rapid recalculation of a man who has been running the same play for 15 years and is suddenly facing a formation he hasn't seen before. Whatever you think you're doing here, Nolan said, lowering his voice to a register intended to intimidate, you should reconsider very carefully. Volkov didn't respond. He looked at Nolan the way a man looks at a clock, checking whether it's time. It was. He reached into his jacket pocket, and that was when every window on the east wall of the ballroom exploded inward. The sound was catastrophic. A wall of shattering glass that hit the crowd like a physical blow, followed by the scream of wind tearing through the gap and the immediate primal roar of 300 people reacting to the sudden violent end of everything that had felt safe. Chandeliers swayed violently. Champagne flutes fell from nerveless fingers and shattered across the marble floor. Women screamed. Men dropped into instinctive crouches. The string quartet stopped mid-phrase, instruments clattering. Volkov's hand closed around Seraphina's arm and pulled her down behind the nearest marble pillar in a single fluid motion. His body was between her and the shattered windows, his back curved over her like a shield. Glass fragments rained across the floor around them, catching the chandelier light like scattered diamonds. Soren, Volkov said. One word. Not a question. Through the chaos, Seraphina could see dark shapes moving at the perimeter of the ballroom. Men in tactical gear entering through the destroyed windows, boots crunching on broken glass, weapons shouldered with the mechanical efficiency of people who had done this many times before. 4 of them. 6. 8. Victor Soren hadn't waited for the exposure. He'd preempted it. The gala itself was the trap. Not Nolan's trap this time, but Soren's. He'd known Volkov would come. He'd known why. And he'd decided that the cleanest solution was to eliminate the threat in a room full of witnesses who could be told whatever story served his purposes afterward. Gunfire erupted from the far side of the ballroom. Volkov's security team, positioned throughout the room in formal wear that concealed body armor and compact weapons, returned fire with disciplined bursts. The sound was staggering in the enclosed space, flat, percussive concussions that rattled Seraphina's teeth and compressed her eardrums into a continuous high-pitched whine. "The drive!" she shouted over the noise. "Give me the drive!" "What?" "The broadcast team. 3rd floor. You said they're in position. Give me the drive. I'll get it to them." "You can't—" "The stairwell. You can't leave this floor. Soren's people are here for you. If you move toward the exits, they'll follow. But they're not looking for me." She grabbed his jacket and pulled him close enough that she could see the individual striations in his irises, dark brown on darker brown. "Give me the drive, Damien." He stared at her. Around them the world was coming apart. Screams, gunfire, the crash of overturned tables, and the tinkling cascade of a chandelier breaking free from its mooring and exploding across the dance floor. But in the space between them, in the 18 inches of air separating his face from hers, there was a stillness that felt like the center of a wheel. He pressed the drive into her palm. His fingers closed over hers for 1 second. His eyes said everything his mouth didn't. She ran, not the way civilians run. Panicked, directionless, driven by the blind instinct to get away from loud sounds. She ran the way Marin had trained her, low, fast, using the marble pillars as cover, moving in the gaps between bursts of gunfire. The ballroom was a landscape of overturned tables and shattered glass and bodies pressed flat against the floor, and she navigated it with a focus so intense that the fear became abstract. A data point rather than an emotion, noted and filed and overridden by the mechanical imperative to reach the stairwell on the north wall. A man in tactical gear spotted her at 30 feet. He swung his weapon toward her. A shot from somewhere behind her. Volkov's team dropped him before he could fire. He fell sideways across a tablecloth stained with spilled wine, and she stepped over his legs without breaking stride. The stairwell door. She hit it with her shoulder and it banged open. Concrete stairs, fluorescent lighting, the sudden acoustic shift from the ballroom's chaos to the echoing emptiness of an enclosed vertical shaft. She kicked off her heels and took the stairs barefoot, 2 at a time. The cold concrete biting into her soles the same way the penthouse marble had bitten into them 6 weeks ago. 3rd floor. The hallway was empty, room 312. Marin had drilled the number into her. She found the door, knocked 3 times in the pattern she'd been given. It opened. A man she didn't recognize, mid-30s, headset, laptop open on a table behind him, looked at her with an expression that suggested he hadn't expected the delivery person to be wearing a gold silk gown and bleeding from a glass cut across her right forearm. "From Volkov," she said, and held out the drive. He took it, plugged it in. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the speed of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. 60 seconds to broadcast, he said. Seraphina leaned against the doorframe and pressed her hand against the cut on her arm. The blood was warm and slippery and real. Below her, through 3 floors of concrete and steel, she could hear the muffled thunder of the battle in the ballroom, a sound like the heartbeat of a building that was dying. 30 seconds. She closed her eyes. Gerald Wynn's face, Judith Cross's hands gripping her desk, Nolan's cufflinks, the rain on the penthouse windows, every moment that had led to this one, every betrayal, every manipulation, every choice she'd made, and every choice that had been made for her, converging into a single point of irreversible action. Broadcasting. She opened her eyes. On the laptop screen, she watched the evidence deploy. Financial records, transaction logs, intercepted communications, account structures, streaming simultaneously to every major news outlet in Blackthorn City and projected onto the ballroom's display screens 3 floors below. Nolan Pierce's name, repeated like a drumbeat through hundreds of pages of documentation. Victor Soren's network, mapped in forensic detail. Raymond Ash's federal complicity, documented with timestamps and amounts. It was out. All of it. Irreversible. Unstoppable. The information was spreading through the city's media infrastructure at the speed of light, and no amount of legal maneuvering or violence or threats could recall it. Below her, the gunfire intensified, and then, abruptly, changed. The disciplined tactical burst shifted to something wilder, more desperate. Soren's men had seen the screens. They knew the mission had failed. The exposure was complete. She started back down the stairs, barefoot, bleeding, the gold dress torn at the hem where she'd caught it on a stairwell railing. She didn't look like a socialite anymore. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like something that had been forged in a fire that was still burning. She reached the ballroom level and pushed through the stairwell door into a scene of devastation. Overturned tables, shattered glass, bullet holes stitched across marble walls. Emergency lights cast everything in harsh red and white. Federal agents, real ones, not Raymond Ash's compromised team, were pouring through the main entrance, weapons drawn, responding to the broadcast that had just detonated across every screen in the city. She found Volkov near the east wall, blood on his hands, and a cut above his left eye that was bleeding freely into his eyebrow. 2 of his security team flanked him, weapons still raised, scanning the smoke-filled room. "It's done," she said. He looked at her, blood and sweat and the aftermath of violence written across his face. But behind all of it, behind the operational mask, behind the 15 years of war and loss and calculated fury, she saw something she'd never seen before. Relief. "Nolan," she said, "where is he?" Volkov's expression hardened. "Garage. Underground level. He ran when the windows blew. He's trying to get out. He won't. Federal teams are covering every exit, but..." He paused. Something in his tone shifted. "Soren isn't in the ballroom. His men were a diversion. He's on the roof." "The roof?" "Helicopter. He has an extraction plan." Volkov wiped blood from his eye with the back of his hand. "If he gets airborne, he disappears. New identity, new country. The The evidence on the drive proves his network exists, but without him in custody, the network adapts. It survives. It rebuilds. He looked toward the service stairwell that led to the upper floors, the rooftop. Seraphina grabbed his arm. Don't. I have to. Send your people. Send the feds. Don't go up there yourself. He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. The cut above his eye had sent a rivulet of blood down his cheek that tracked along the old scar on his jaw, old wound meeting new. This one is mine, he said quietly. It's always been mine. He pulled away and moved toward the stairwell. His security team followed, but he stopped them with a raised hand. One word in that language she still didn't know. They stopped. He went alone. The stairwell door closed behind him. And Seraphina stood in the ruins of the ballroom, surrounded by broken glass and the rising wail of sirens from the streets below, knowing that somewhere above her, on a rain-swept rooftop in the dark, the man who had pulled her from the storm was walking toward the one fight she couldn't follow him into. The rooftop stairwell was 12 flights of bare concrete and rusted metal railings, and Damian Volkov climbed them the way he did everything, with a mechanical efficiency that disguised the fact that his body was failing him. The cut above his eye had clotted into a thick crust that pulled at his skin every time he blinked. Two of his ribs on the left side were cracked. He could feel them grinding against each other with every breath, a wet, nauseating friction that sent bolts of white pain through his torso. His right hand was swollen where he'd broken a knuckle against a man's skull in the ballroom. He flexed it as he climbed and felt the bones shift wrong. None of it mattered. He'd been climbing toward this moment for 15 years, and the body was just the vehicle. It would hold together long enough, or it wouldn't. Either way, he was going up. The rooftop access door was a steel slab marked with faded emergency exit signage. He hit it with his shoulder, the left one, sparing the cracked ribs. And it banged open into wind and rain and the deafening chop of helicopter blades. The rooftop of the Blackthorn Grand was a flat expanse of tar paper and ventilation housings, bordered by a concrete parapet wall 3 feet high. The helicopter sat at the center, a matte black Augusta, rotors spinning at idle speed, navigation lights blinking red and white against the low cloud ceiling. Rain sheeted horizontally across the roof, driven by the rotor wash into stinging needles that found every exposed surface. Victor Soren stood beside the open cabin door. He was smaller than Volkov remembered. Time had compressed him, shortened the thick neck, rounded the heavy shoulders, added a softness to the midsection that spoke of years spent giving orders from comfortable chairs rather than executing them personally. His hair, once dark, was iron gray and plastered to his skull by the rain. He wore a dark overcoat that whipped in the rotor wash, and in his right hand he held a compact pistol with the casual familiarity of a man holding a telephone. He saw Volkov and didn't run, didn't shout to the pilot, didn't raise the weapon. Instead, he stood there with the rain streaming down his face and watched Volkov approach with an expression that looked almost like satisfaction. The look of a man who has been waiting for something and is relieved to see it finally arrive. "Damian," his voice was barely audible over the helicopter. "I wondered if you'd come yourself." Volkov stopped 10 feet away. The rain hammered the roof between them. Water pooled around their feet, running in sheets toward the drainage grates. "Turn off the engine, Victor." "Why? So we can have a conversation?" Soren smiled. It was a terrible smile, the smile of a man who has stopped pretending that any of this is civilized. "We're past conversation. We've been past it for 15 years. "Then why are you still standing there?" Soren considered this. His thumb moved along the grip of the pistol, not raising it, just touching it the way a person touches a familiar object for reassurance. "Because I wanted to see your face," he said, "before the end. Whichever end. I wanted to see if you still look like the boy who crawled out of that warehouse in 2011 with his sister's blood on his hands." Volkov's expression didn't change, but his body changed. A subtle shift in weight, a lowering of his center of gravity, the imperceptible coiling of muscles preparing for movement. Seraphina would have recognized it. Marin would have recognized it. Soren, who had known Volkov longer than either of them, recognized it too. "There it is," Soren said softly. "There he is." He raised the pistol. Volkov moved. The distance between them was 10 feet. Volkov covered it in less than 2 seconds, driving forward with an explosive push from his back leg that sent a blade of agony through his cracked ribs. The first shot went past his left ear, close enough to feel the displacement of air, close enough to hear the supersonic crack of the bullet breaking the sound barrier inches from his skull. The second shot caught the fabric of his jacket at the shoulder, tearing through cloth but missing flesh. He hit Soren at full speed. The impact drove both men sideways across the wet roof. Soren's back slammed against the helicopter's landing skid, and the pistol discharged a third time, into the air, harmlessly, as Volkov's hand closed around Soren's wrist and forced the weapon upward. They grappled against the skid, boots sliding on the rain-slick surface, faces inches apart. Soren's breath was sour with adrenaline and old scotch. His eyes were wide and wild and furious. "She was 23, Volkov said through his teeth. "She was 23 years old and she had nothing to do with any of this." He twisted Soren's wrist. The older man screamed, a raw animal sound torn from deep in his chest, and the pistol clattered to the roof. Volkov kicked it away. It spun across the wet tar paper and disappeared over the edge of the building. Soren drove his knee into Volkov's damaged ribs. The pain was astronomical, a white supernova that detonated behind Volkov's eyes and buckled his knees. He went down on one knee, and Soren was on him immediately, hands around his throat, pressing him backward toward the parapet wall. The concrete edge caught Volkov at the small of his back, and he felt the void behind him. 40 stories of empty air and rain, and the distant, indifferent street below. Soren's face was twisted with effort, the veins in his neck standing out like cables. His fingers dug into Volkov's throat with the strength of a man fighting for survival. Not strategy, not technique, just the raw hydraulic force of a human being who understands that this is the last thing he will ever do. Volkov couldn't breathe. His vision was narrowing, the edges going gray, the center contracting to a bright point that contained only Soren's face and the rain falling behind it. His hands clawed at Soren's arms, but the grip was locked, the thumbs pressed into his windpipe with killing force. He stopped fighting the choke. Instead, he reached up with his right hand, the one with the broken knuckle, and found Soren's face. His thumb pressed into Soren's left eye socket, not gently, not as a threat, with the deliberate grinding force of a man driving a nail into wood. Soren released him with a howl that was swallowed by the rotor wash. He staggered backward, one hand over his eye, blood streaming between his fingers. Volkov sucked air through his damaged throat, a rasping, desperate inhalation that sounded like fabric tearing, and forced himself upright. They stood 6 feet apart on the rain-swept roof, both bleeding, both broken, both operating on reserves that had been empty for minutes. The helicopter engine whined behind Soren, its blades chopping the rain into fine mist that caught the navigation lights and turned the air around them into something that glowed red and white, like the inside of a dying star. "You can't win this," Soren said. Blood ran from behind his hand and down his cheek, mixing with the rain. "You take me down. Someone else takes my place. The network survives. It always survives. You've been fighting this war for 15 years and you haven't changed anything. You've just accumulated damage." "Maybe," Volkov said. His voice was wrecked, a hoarse, guttural rasp that barely carried over the noise. "But you won't be there to see it," he charged again. This time there was no technique, no training, no calculated angles or tactical positioning, just 2 men at the end of everything, fighting with fists and elbows and teeth on a rooftop in a storm. Volkov took a punch to the jaw that snapped his head sideways and sent a spray of blood and saliva into the wind. He responded with a knee to Soren's midsection that doubled the older man over, then drove his elbow down into the back of Soren's skull. Soren went to his knees. His hands found the wet tar paper and he pushed himself up with the trembling, stubborn persistence of a man who has never lost and cannot conceptualize the possibility. He swung wildly, a looping right hand that caught nothing but rain, and his momentum carried him forward, off balance, toward the parapet wall. His shin caught the low concrete edge. His upper body kept moving. For one fraction of a second, he was balanced on the wall, half on, half off, arms pinwheeling against the wind and the rain and the 40-story drop. Volkov lunged for him, not to push him over, to catch him. His hand closed around the fabric of Soren's overcoat, felt the weight of the man pulling against gravity, felt his cracked ribs scream in protest as the physics of the moment demanded more than his body had left to give. The coat tore, The fabric separated along the shoulder seam with a sound like a gasp, and Volkov was left holding a strip of wet wool while Victor Soren's body tilted backward into empty space, arms reaching for something that wasn't there, eyes wide with the absolute comprehension of a man who has finally arrived at a destination he spent his whole life trying to avoid. He didn't scream. That was the part Volkov would remember later. The silence, the rain, the diminishing shape of a man falling through darkness toward a street he would never reach as anything other than evidence. Then he was gone. Volkov stood at the parapet wall with a strip of torn fabric in his hand and listened to the silence that followed. The helicopter idled behind him, its blades slowing as the pilot, sensing the outcome, began to shut down the engine. The rain continued to fall. The city continued to glow beneath him, indifferent and enormous and completely unaware that a war had just ended on this rooftop. He dropped the fabric. It caught the wind and spiraled down into the dark. He turned and walked back toward the stairwell door. Each step was a negotiation between his body and his will, the ribs grinding, the swollen knuckle throbbing, the bruised throat aching with every inhalation. He made it to the door and through it and down 4 flights before his legs gave out. He sat on the concrete steps in the fluorescent light and pressed his back against the wall and breathed in shallow, careful sips of air that tasted like blood and concrete dust. He sat there for 3 minutes, then he stood up and kept going. Seraphina found him on the 9th floor landing. She was barefoot, her gold dress torn and blood-stained, a makeshift bandage wrapped around the glass cut on her forearm. She'd been climbing toward him when the stairwell door opened and he appeared, battered, bleeding from the mouth and the eyebrow, his tuxedo jacket torn at the shoulder, his right hand held against his chest in a way that told her something in it was broken. They looked at each other across the landing. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting their shadows in sharp, colorless relief against the concrete walls. "Soren?" she asked. "Gone." She didn't ask what gone meant. His face told her everything. The exhaustion, the hollow aftermath, the particular emptiness of a man who has achieved the thing he spent 15 years pursuing and is now standing in the space where the purpose used to be. She walked to him and put her hand on his chest. Not his arm, not his shoulder. His chest, directly over his heart, where she could feel the heavy, irregular thud of it working to keep him alive. His shirt was soaked through with rain and sweat and someone else's blood, and beneath the fabric his heart beat with the stubborn, animal persistence of a machine that doesn't know how to stop. "Let's go down," she said. He nodded. They descended the remaining flights together, her arm under his weight leaning into her more heavily with each floor. By the time they reached the ballroom level, he was barely upright, and she was carrying a third of his body weight on her shoulder. The ballroom was a different world from the one she'd left. Federal agents in tactical gear had secured every entrance. Paramedics moved through the debris, treating the injured. The display screens that had broadcast Nolan's evidence were dark now, but the damage was done. Seraphina could see it in the faces of the agents, in the urgent conversations happening in clusters throughout the room, in the phones glowing in every hand as the city's media infrastructure consumed and distributed the information that was, at this moment, rewriting every assumption Blackthorn had ever made about the man it once called untouchable. Nolan Pierce was on his knees in the underground parking garage when they found him. Not metaphorically. Literally on his knees, hands zip-tied behind his back, surrounded by 4 federal agents and a woman in a dark suit who was reading him a list of charges long enough to constitute a short novel. His face was gray, the color of concrete, the color of systems failing, the color of a man watching the architecture of his entire life collapse in real time. Beside him on the concrete floor sat a briefcase, open. Inside were 3 encrypted hard drives that he'd been carrying when the agents intercepted him. Hard drives containing the financial records he'd planned to take with him. The emergency extraction kit of a man who always had an exit strategy. He didn't have one anymore. Seraphina stood 10 feet away and looked at the man she'd married when she was 24 years old. The man who'd held her hand at their wedding and whispered promises against her hair. The man who'd taught her which fork to use at state dinners, and how to smile for cameras, and how to make herself small enough to fit inside the life he'd built. The man who'd signed her name to documents designed to destroy her, who'd looked at her across $40 million worth of Italian marble and told her she was never good enough for his world. He was on his knees on a parking garage floor, and his world was over. She waited for the satisfaction to come. The vindication. The soaring, cinematic triumph of a woman scorned who had returned to claim her revenge. It didn't come. What came instead was something quieter and more painful, a kind of exhaustion so deep it felt geological. Layer upon layer of accumulated damage, compressed by time and pressure into something dense and heavy and permanent. She had won. The evidence was public. Nolan was finished. Soren was dead. And she felt nothing that resembled victory. She felt like a woman standing in a parking garage at midnight with bleeding feet and a torn dress, looking at the ruins of a marriage that should never have existed. Nolan raised his head. His eyes found hers through the chaos of agents and equipment and flashing lights. For a moment, just a moment, the mask dropped completely. Not the cold administrative mask of the man who'd handed her divorce papers. Not the confident, calculating mask of the man who'd orchestrated her financial destruction. Something deeper. Something she hadn't seen since the very beginning, when he was just a man at a cocktail party with a Roman nose and a way of listening that made you feel like the only person alive. Fear. Raw, unprocessed, animal fear. The fear of a man who has finally run out of moves and is staring at the rest of his life and seeing nothing but walls. Sarah, he said. His voice cracked on the syllable, the nickname he'd used in the first year of their marriage, before the endearments calcified into formalities and the formalities calcified into silence. It wasn't supposed to. Stop, she said. He stopped. She stepped closer, close enough to see the sweat on his upper lip, the broken capillaries in his eyes, the way his bound hands trembled behind his back, close enough to smell the whiskey and expensive cologne and the sharp metallic scent of a man whose body was producing the chemistry of collapse. You want to tell me it wasn't personal, she said, that the documents were business, that the divorce was strategic, that none of it was about me. He said nothing. His jaw worked silently. But it was personal, Nolan. You made it personal when you stood in our home and told me I was never good enough. You made it personal when you put my name on $94 million of fraud and walked away with Celeste on your arm like I was a receipt you'd filed. She crouched in front of him, eye level. The concrete was cold under her bare knees. I'm not going to gloat. I'm not going to give a speech about justice. I'm just going to tell you something I wish I'd understood 9 years ago. She held his gaze. I was always good enough. For this world. For any world. I was good enough the day I met you, and I was good enough the night you threw me out. The only thing I wasn't good enough at was seeing you clearly. And now I do. She stood. Her knees ached from the concrete. She turned and walked away without looking back. Behind her, Nolan Pierce lowered his head, and the agents led him toward a waiting vehicle. She never spoke to him again. The weeks after the gala unfolded like a slow exhalation, the city releasing a breath it had been holding for decades. Federal investigations expanded daily. The evidence from Volkov's drive, now in the possession of legitimate investigators who had not been compromised by Raymond Ash, generated indictments that spread through Blackthorn's power structure like cracks through ice. Board members, investment partners, government officials, attorneys. Ash himself was arrested at his office on a Tuesday morning, handcuffed in front of his staff, his face the color of wet ash. Nolan's trial dominated the news for months. The charges filled 17 pages. Wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, racketeering, identity theft. The construction contracts that never existed, the shell companies bearing Seraphina's forged authorizations, the offshore accounts that had funneled Victor Soren's narcotics revenue into legitimate investments, all of it documented, cataloged, and presented to a grand jury that returned indictments in under 4 hours. Celeste Arden disappeared from public life. No press statement, no social media farewell. She simply vanished into whatever private infrastructure catches people who attach themselves to power and found themselves holding nothing when the power collapsed. Seraphina didn't follow the story. She didn't need to. Judith Cross cooperated fully, providing the original win records to investigators in exchange for immunity. She closed her practice afterward and moved to a small town in Vermont whose name Seraphina never learned. Marin confirmed she was safe. That was enough. Emily Wynne was told the truth about her father. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to understand that Gerald had been a frightened man who made terrible choices for understandable reasons, and that his last act before dying had been to genuinely consider, doing the right thing. It wasn't redemption, but it was something Emily could carry without it breaking her. Damien Volkov's empire changed. Not overnight, empires don't dissolve like sugar, but steadily, deliberately, with the same methodical precision he applied to everything. Businesses were transferred to legitimate management. Operations were restructured or shuttered. The network of shadows and silence that had made him the invisible king of Blackthorn's underworld was dismantled piece by piece, not by external force, but by internal decision. He never announced it. There was no press conference, no public transformation narrative. He simply stopped. The way a man stops smoking or stops fighting. Not because the habit lost its appeal, but because he recognized that the person he'd become in service of the habit was someone he no longer wanted to be. He told Seraphina about Katya one night, 3 months after the gala. They were sitting on the porch of a house he'd purchased outside the city. A modest house by his standards, 3 bedrooms, a garden, a view of the hills that turned amber in the late afternoon light. He told her about the warehouse where Soren's men had taken his sister, about the phone call that had summoned him there, about what he found inside, and about the sound he made when he found it, a sound he didn't know human beings could produce, a sound that came from somewhere below language and below grief and below anything that could ever be repaired. He told her that the scar on his jaw was from that night, that one of Soren's men had cut him while he was carrying Katya's body out of the building, that he'd barely felt it. Seraphina listened without speaking. When he was finished, she took his hand, the right one, the one with the knuckle that had healed crooked, and held it between both of hers. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say it would be okay. She just held his hand and let the silence do what silence does when words are too small for the space they're trying to fill. They sat like that for a long time, watching the light change. 6 months after the gala, the Vale Foundation opened its doors in a restored historic building in downtown Blackthorn. It occupied 3 floors of what had once been a bank. Marble floors, high windows, the kind of architecture that whispered authority. Seraphina chose it deliberately. She wanted the women who walked through those doors to feel immediately and viscerally that they were entering a place of power. Not charity, power. The foundation provided legal representation for women trapped in financial abuse. It offered shelter, counseling, financial literacy programs, and, most importantly, a network of advocates who understood that leaving a dangerous man was not a single act of courage, but a sustained campaign of survival that required resources, strategy, and people who refused to look away. Seraphina ran it the way she ran everything now, with the calm, precise, unflinching competence of a woman who had learned what power was by watching it used against her and had decided to point it in a different direction. On the evening of the foundation's opening, she stood on the balcony of the building's top floor and looked out across the Blackthorn skyline. The city glowed beneath a clear sky, towers and bridges, and the dark ribbon of the river running through it all like a vein. It was the same skyline she'd seen from the penthouse window the night Nolan handed her divorce papers, the same city she'd walked through barefoot and bleeding, the same streets that had tried to swallow her. It looked different now. Not because it had changed, because she had. The balcony door opened behind her. She didn't turn. She knew the sound of his footsteps. Volkov stood beside her. He was wearing a dark suit without a tie, the collar of his shirt open. The scar on his jaw caught the city light. His hands, the crooked knuckle, the calloused palms, the fingers that had held weapons and documents, and the torn fabric of a dead man's coat, rested on the railing beside hers. Marin tells me the foundation received 200 applications for services in the first week, he said. 214. That's a lot of women. That's a lot of men who thought they could get away with it. He was quiet for a moment. The city hummed beneath them. You could have taken everything for yourself, he said. The resources, the connections, the leverage. You could have built something that served your own interests. No one would have blamed you. She looked out across the lights. I already have everything I wanted. He studied her profile, the line of her jaw, the set of her mouth, the eyes that had once been full of fear and were now full of something harder and more durable. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small velvet box. He didn't open it. He placed it on the railing between them, beside her hand, with the care of a man placing the last piece of something he'd been building for a very long time. She looked at the box, then at him. I'm not asking you to be anything, he said. Not a wife, not a partner in whatever remains of what I used to be. I'm asking you to be the thing you already are, and to let me stand next to it." She picked up the box and opened it. Inside, a ring caught the city light. Simple, elegant, a single stone set in platinum that gleamed like a small contained fire. Not a promise of protection, not a symbol of rescue or obligation, or the elaborate fictions that men constructed to make ownership look like love. A recognition of equals. Of two people who had walked through the worst versions of themselves and come out the other side carrying something that neither of them had expected to find. She looked at the ring for a long time. Then she looked at him, at the scar, at the tired eyes, at the crooked knuckle, and the mouth that never quite relaxed, and the face of a man who had spent 15 years in the dark and was only now, cautiously, learning what it felt like to stand in the light. She slipped the ring onto her finger. She didn't say yes. She didn't need to. The gesture was the answer. He exhaled, a long, slow breath that carried the weight of 15 years and released it into the night air over Blackthorn City. His hand found hers on the railing, his fingers interlaced with hers, carefully, the crooked knuckle fitting against her palm like a key, fitting a lock it was always meant to open. They stood there together as the city moved beneath them, traffic and sirens, and the distant pulse of music from the harbor district. The ordinary, relentless sounds of a world that kept going, regardless of the storms it survived. Seraphina looked down at the street below. Somewhere on that pavement, 6 months ago, a woman had walked barefoot through the rain with a broken suitcase and a ruined life. That woman had been terrified and alone, and convinced that the world she'd lost was the only one that existed. She had been wrong. The world was larger than one man's cruelty, larger than one city's corruption, larger than the elegant architecture of lies that powerful people constructed to keep everyone else small. And the woman who had walked through that rain, who had bled on that concrete, who had gotten into a stranger's car because she had no other choice, who had learned to fight and manipulate and destroy because the alternative was destruction, that woman was still here, standing on a balcony above a city she'd helped to change, wearing a ring that meant something only because the person who gave it understood that she didn't need it. The wind picked up, carrying the salt smell of the harbor and the distant sound of a ship's horn. She closed her eyes and felt it on her face. The same wind that had driven the rain the night everything ended and everything began. She opened her eyes. The city glowed, and beneath the endless skyline of Blackthorn City, the woman once abandoned in the rain stood untouchable, not because someone had made her that way, but because she had made herself.